Prepare yourself for a journey beyond the ordinary, into the shadows of your deepest fears. Welcome to the world of Mr. Scary Guy. My name is Bill, and I need to tell you about something that happened to me last summer. I've never been the type to believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but after this experience, I don't know what to think anymore. It all started with a letter from my Aunt Margaret. I hadn't seen or heard from her in years. My family wasn't particularly close-knit, and she lived in a small town upstate, far from my life in the city. The letter was an invitation. Uncle Robert, her husband, was gravely ill, and she wanted me to visit. The tone was urgent, almost desperate. She said Uncle Robert had specifically asked for me. I couldn't recall a single meaningful interaction with him, but out of respect and curiosity, I decided to go. The idea of an old mansion tucked away in a remote town had its own strange allure. The drive took almost 6 hours, winding through dense forests and narrow, unmarked roads. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the property. The mansion was enormous, looming like a dark sentinel. It was the kind of place that looked like it had secrets, with ivy creeping up the walls and windows that seemed to watch you. Aunt Margaret greeted me at the door, her face a mask of worry and fatigue. She was a small, frail woman, her eyes sunken and voice barely a whisper. She led me through the dimly lit corridors, each room more oppressive than the last. We finally reached Uncle Robert's room, a spacious chamber dominated by a large canopy bed. He looked even worse than I had imagined. His skin was pale and clammy, and his breathing was shallow. His eyes, however, were alert and seemed to bore into me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Aunt Margaret left us alone, and I sat by his bedside, unsure of what to say.
"Bill,"
he rasped, his voice a mere croak.
"I'm glad you came. There's something you need to know."
I leaned in closer, the air around us thick and still.
"Years ago, this house, it wasn't always ours. We took it, Bill. We took it from a family that lived here for generations. There was a misunderstanding, and they were forced out. Their anger, their pain, it never left. It lingers."
He paused, struggling for breath, and I felt a chill run down my spine.
"Their spirits,"
he continued,
"are restless. They seek revenge. And now that I'm dying, they'll come for me. But they won't stop there. They'll come for anyone who tries to claim this house as theirs."
I didn't know what to say. The rational part of me dismissed his words as the ramblings of a dying man, but something in his eyes made me uneasy. Uncle Robert died that night. His passing was quiet, almost as if he had simply slipped away. Aunt Margaret was inconsolable, and I stayed to help her with the arrangements. The funeral was a small affair, attended by a few distant relatives and old friends. After the funeral, Aunt Margaret asked me to stay for a few more days to help with the paperwork and other formalities. I agreed, although the mansion's oppressive atmosphere was starting to get to me. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to explore the house. I had a flashlight with me as I wandered through the dark, dusty corridors. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I found myself drawn to a door at the end of a long hallway. It was locked, but I managed to find the key in a nearby drawer. The door opened with a groan, revealing a steep staircase leading down to what appeared to be a basement. The air grew colder as I descended, and an inexplicable sense of dread settled over me. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, broken tools, and various other odds and ends. In the far corner, I saw a large, old trunk. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it hadn't been touched in years. Something compelled me to open it. Inside, I found old photographs, letters, and a diary. The photographs depicted a happy family posing in front of the mansion. The letters spoke of their love for the house, their hopes and dreams. The diary, however, told a different story. It belonged to a woman named Susan, the matriarch of the family. Her entries started off cheerful, but gradually became darker and more frantic. She wrote about how they were being forced out, how they had nowhere else to go, how they felt betrayed. Her final entries were almost incoherent, filled with rage and despair. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of guilt. My family had taken this house from them, and now their spirits were trapped here, consumed by their anger. As I stood there, lost in thought, I heard a faint whisper. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the walls.
Leave. Leave this place.
I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly. There was no one there, but the whispering continued, growing more urgent. The air seemed to thicken, and I struggled to breathe. I stumbled back up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it, as if that could keep whatever was down there at bay. I tried to rationalize what I had experienced, but the sense of unease lingered. That night, I dreamt of the family in the photographs. They were standing outside the mansion, staring at me with hollow eyes. Susan stepped forward, her face twisted in a mask of grief and rage.
You took everything from us.
She whispered.
Now, we will take everything from you.
I woke up in a cold sweat, the memory of the dream vivid in my mind. I knew I couldn't stay in the mansion any longer. I had to leave, but Aunt Margaret needed me. I decided to convince her to leave with me, to find a new place where we could start fresh. The next day, I broached the subject with her. She was reluctant, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She had felt the presence too, even if she didn't want to admit it. We decided to leave the following morning. I packed my bags and helped Aunt Margaret with hers. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the whispering again. It was louder this time, more aggressive. The air grew cold, and I could see my breath forming in the air. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and hurried to Aunt Margaret's room. She was sitting on the bed, her face pale and eyes wide with fear.
They're here,
she whispered.
They won't let us leave.
I tried to reassure her, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. We heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking towards us. I shined my flashlight towards the door, but there was no one there. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and the whispering grew louder, more urgent.
Leave. Leave this place.
I grabbed Aunt Margaret's hand and pulled her towards the window. We climbed out onto the balcony and made our way down the fire escape. The whispering followed us, growing fainter as we put more distance between us and the mansion. We drove through the night, not stopping until we reached a small motel on the outskirts of town. We were both exhausted, but the sense of relief was palpable. We had escaped, but the memory of what we had experienced stayed with us. Aunt Margaret and I moved to a small apartment in the city, far from the mansion and its dark history. We tried to move on with our lives, but the events of that night haunted us. I did some research and found out that the family who originally owned the mansion had indeed been forced out under suspicious circumstances. They had nowhere else to go and eventually died in poverty. Their anger and despair had left a mark on the mansion, a stain that could never be erased. I still have nightmares about that place, about the whispers and the footsteps in the dark. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget what happened, but I know one thing for sure. Some places are haunted not by ghosts, but by the memories of those who suffered there. And those memories, those lingering emotions, can be far more terrifying than any ghost. I've always been a light sleeper, easily stirred by the slightest sounds or changes in my environment. Maybe that's why this experience still haunts me to this day. It was an ordinary Tuesday night, and I had fallen asleep around midnight, exhausted from a long day at work. Little did I know that the events of that night would change my perspective on reality forever. I awoke abruptly, the darkness of my bedroom pressing in on me. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. 3 a.m. The devil's hour, they call it. I'd heard stories about this particular time of night. The theories about it being a period when the veil between our world and the supernatural is at its thinnest. I used to brush them off as mere superstition, but that night, everything felt different. The room was unusually cold, despite it being the middle of summer. A chill ran down my spine as I noticed the slight condensation of my breath in the air. I sat up in bed trying to shake off the grogginess when I heard a faint whisper. At first I thought it was just my imagination, a remnant of a dream I couldn't quite remember. But then, the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. There was no response, just the continued murmuring, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. My curiosity got the better of me, and I swung my legs over the side of the bed, feeling the cool hardwood floor beneath my feet. As I approached the bedroom door, the whispering abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, almost suffocating. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob before finally mustering the courage to turn it. The door creaked open, revealing the dimly lit hallway. I stepped out, my senses on high alert. The house was eerily quiet. I checked each room, starting with the bathroom, then the spare bedroom, and finally the living room. Everything seemed normal, undisturbed. But as I turned to head back to my bedroom, I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the basement door. It was a sound I hadn't heard in years, the familiar steady tap of my grandmother's cane. My grandmother had passed away nearly a decade ago, and the cane had been stored in the attic ever since. The rational part of my mind insisted that it was impossible, that I was just imagining things in my half-awake state. But curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of dread, compelled me to investigate further. I approached the basement door cautiously, the tapping continuing in its relentless rhythm. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, the cold metal sending a shiver up my arm. With a deep breath, I turned the knob and slowly opened the door. The darkness of the basement seemed to swallow the weak light from the hallway, creating an abyss of shadows. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers finally finding it and flipping it on. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered to life, casting a dim glow over the cluttered space. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt even more unsettling. I descended the creaky wooden steps, each one groaning under my weight. As I reached the bottom, I saw the cane. It was propped up against an old, dusty armchair, the very one my grandmother used to sit in. My heart lurched at the sight, memories flooding back of her sitting there, telling me stories of her own childhood. I approached the cane, reaching out to touch it, when I felt a sudden, bone-chilling cold envelop me. The light bulb flickered and went out, plunging the basement into darkness. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a loose floorboard. I fell hard, the impact jarring, but quickly forgotten as a new sound emerged from the shadows. A slow, deliberate scraping. It was coming from the far corner of the basement, where the shadows seemed to move and writhe as if alive. I struggled to get up, my eyes straining to see in the darkness. The scraping grew louder, closer, and then I saw them. Two glowing eyes, reflecting what little light remained, staring at me with an intensity that froze me in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The eyes moved closer, and I could make out a shape, a figure, hunched and grotesque, dragging something heavy behind it. As it came into view, I saw what it was dragging. A large, old-fashioned trunk, the kind my grandmother used to keep her belongings in. The figure stopped just a few feet from me, and I could see its face, or rather, the lack of one. It was a blank, featureless expanse, save for the eyes that bore into me. It raised a hand, pointing directly at me, and in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, it spoke my name.
Thomas.
I don't know how I found the strength to move, but adrenaline kicked in and I scrambled to my feet, backing away toward the stairs. The figure didn't follow, but its eyes never left me. I ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me and locking it. I stood there, panting, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That I'd seen a ghost? A monster? They'd think I was crazy. Instead, I did the only thing that seemed sensible at the time. I grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife and sat in the living room, waiting for dawn. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside, made my skin crawl. When the first light of morning finally seeped through the windows, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I decided to investigate the basement again, hoping that in the daylight, things would make more sense. Armed with my flashlight, I descended the stairs once more. The basement looked as it always had, cluttered, dusty, and harmless. The cane was still there, leaning against the armchair, but the trunk and the figure were gone. I approached the spot where the figure had stood, my flashlight beam revealing nothing out of the ordinary. But then I noticed something on the floor, a small, silver locket. I picked it up, recognizing it immediately as my grandmother's. She had worn it every day, and it had been buried with her. I opened the locket with trembling hands, revealing the tiny portrait of my grandfather inside. That was the final straw. I left the house immediately, staying with a friend for the next few days while I tried to make sense of what had happened. When I finally returned, I had the basement door sealed shut and moved the cane to a storage unit far away from the house. I never experienced anything like that again, but the memory of that night still haunts me. I often wonder if it was my grandmother trying to communicate with me, or something far more sinister using her memory to lure me in. Whatever it was, it left me with a deep-seated fear of waking up at 3 a.m. Now, whenever I see that time on the clock, I can't help but feel a pang of dread. I know most people dismiss stories like mine as mere superstition or overactive imagination, but I've come to believe that there's something more to the devil's hour. Whether it's a time when spirits are more active, or when our minds are more susceptible to the unknown, I can't say for certain. But I do know this: some doors are best left unopened, and some questions are better left unanswered. The next time you wake up at 3 a.m. and the house feels a little too quiet and the shadows seem a little too deep, remember my story. And maybe, just maybe, stay in bed until the sun comes up. It all started with an innocent ad. Free couch, must pick up. I had just moved into my new apartment and was browsing Craigslist for some cheap furniture. When I saw the ad for a free couch, I didn't hesitate. Sure, it was a bit of a drive out to the suburbs, but who could resist free? The address led me to a quiet, older neighborhood, the kind where every house looks the same, and the streets are lined with towering trees. When I arrived, the couch was sitting outside, just as the ad promised. It was a bit worn, but nothing a good cleaning couldn't fix. The house it sat in front of seemed empty. No lights, no cars, no signs of life. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. Figuring it was one of those take-it-and-leave deals, I started loading the couch into my truck. That's when I noticed the smell. At first I thought it was just the couch being old, but as I got closer, the stench became almost unbearable. It was a sickly, sweet smell, like rotting meat mixed with something metallic. I hesitated for a moment, but the thought of driving all the way back without the couch pushed me forward. I yanked it onto my truck bed, and as I did, something fell out from underneath, a small stained envelope. My heart pounded as I picked it up. It was sealed, and my name, was written on it, in neat, almost childlike handwriting. I couldn't resist. I tore it open right there. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just 3 words scrawled across it. "You'll never leave." Chills ran down my spine, but I shook it off as some kind of weird joke. I threw the envelope into the truck and finished loading the couch, eager to get out of there. As I drove back, the smell seemed to get stronger, almost as if it was seeping into the fabric of the truck. I tried rolling down the windows, but it didn't help. The smell clung to me, invading my senses until I felt nauseous. When I got home, I decided to leave the couch in the garage overnight, figuring I'd deal with it in the morning. I needed a shower to wash off the stench, but even after scrubbing myself raw, I couldn't get rid of it. It was like the smell had soaked into my skin. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that note and heard those words echoing in my head. "You'll never leave." I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but when I finally drifted off, I was jolted awake by a loud crash coming from the garage. I jumped out of bed, grabbed a baseball bat, and slowly made my way to the garage. My hands were shaking as I reached for the door. When I opened it, the smell hit me like a wall. It was so overpowering that I gagged, almost vomiting right there. The garage was dark, but in the faint light from the street lamp outside, I could see the couch lying on its side in the middle of the floor. I was sure I had left it upright. My heart raced as I stepped closer. That's when I noticed something moving underneath the couch. I froze, unable to breathe. It was a low, shuffling sound like something was crawling around. The bat slipped from my sweaty hands and clattered to the floor. The sound stopped. I wanted to run, to get out of there, and never look back, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Slowly, I reached down and grabbed the edge of the couch, my whole body trembling. With one quick motion, I flipped it over. There was nothing there, but the smell. It was stronger than ever, like the source was right in front of me. That's when I saw it. A dark stain had seeped through the bottom of the couch, spreading across the garage floor. It looked almost like blood, but darker, thicker. And from the middle of the stain, something was poking out, something small and white. I knelt down, holding my breath as I reached for it. My fingers touched something cold and smooth. I pulled it out slowly, revealing a small white bone. I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I noticed the sound again, the low, shuffling noise, now coming from behind me. I spun around, but the garage was empty, or so I thought. In the shadows, something moved. It was a figure, barely visible in the darkness. It looked like a person, but there was something wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too jerky. As it stepped into the light, I saw its face. It was pale, almost featureless, except for the eyes. 2 dark holes that seemed to suck in the light around them. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure moved closer, its eyes locked on mine. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The garage door was closed, and the only way out was through the figure. It reached out a hand, and I felt a cold, clammy touch on my arm. That's when I snapped. I turned and ran, barreling through the door and into the house. I didn't stop until I was in my car, speeding away from that house, from that couch, from whatever had just touched me. I never went back to that garage. The next day, I packed up my things and left the apartment. I didn't care about breaking the lease or getting my deposit back. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. But no matter where I went, that smell followed me. It's in my clothes, in my skin, in every breath I take. And at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear that shuffling sound, getting closer and closer. My name is Jack, and what I'm about to tell you happened when I was 17 years old. It was supposed to be just another night out with my friends, filled with cotton candy, cheap carnival games, and maybe a scary ride or two. But that night at the carnival, I encountered something far more terrifying than any ride. It all started when we decided to enter the House of Mirrors. You know the kind. Twisting corridors, distorted reflections, and that eerie, flickering light that makes you question whether what you're seeing is real. It was me, my girlfriend Alice, and our two friends, Jenny and Mark. We were all in high spirits, laughing and teasing each other as we navigated through the maze of mirrors. At first, everything was normal. We saw our reflections stretch, shrink, and warp in the glass, and it was all just harmless fun. But as we ventured deeper into the maze, the laughter started to fade. The mirrors seemed to close in on us, and the reflections grew darker, more sinister. It was as if the light was being sucked out of the room. Alice was the first to notice something was off.
Guys, look at this.
She said, pointing to a mirror. We all gathered around to see what she was talking about. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just our reflections staring back at us. But then, I noticed it. There, standing behind us in the mirror, was a clown. Not just any clown, though. This one had a grotesque, painted smile that seemed to stretch too far across its face, and its eyes were dark, empty voids. It stood perfectly still, not moving an inch, as if it were part of the background. I turned around quickly to see if someone was behind us, but there was nothing there, just an empty hallway. "Did anyone see that?" I asked, my voice trembling. The others nodded, their faces pale. But when we looked back at the mirror, the clown was gone. We brushed it off as a trick of the light or maybe some kind of optical illusion. But deep down, I think we all knew something was very wrong. We continued through the maze, but the atmosphere had changed. The air felt heavy, suffocating, and the once harmless mirrors now seemed like portals to another world. A world where something was watching us, waiting. As we turned a corner, we saw it again. The clown, but this time it was closer. Its smile was even wider, its eyes more menacing, and this time, it wasn't just standing still. It was waving at us, a slow, deliberate wave that sent chills down my spine. I screamed, and we all bolted in different directions, desperate to find the exit. The mirrors seemed to multiply, and no matter where I turned, I kept seeing that clown. Closer, closer, until it felt like it was right behind me. I could hear its footsteps, the sound of heavy, dragging feet following me. But every time I turned around, there was nothing. Finally, I burst through an opening and found myself outside, gasping for breath. Alice, Jenny, and Mark stumbled out after me, their faces as white as mine. We didn't say a word, just ran as far away from that house of mirrors as we could. Later that night, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was all just part of the attraction, we told ourselves. Maybe the clowns were actors, playing tricks on us. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that what we had seen wasn't just an illusion. We never spoke of that night again, and I never went back to another carnival. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I can still see that clown's face staring at me from the darkness, its smile stretching impossibly wide. And I wonder, did we ever really escape that maze? Or did a part of us get trapped in those mirrors, where the clowns still watch, waiting for their next victim? It was supposed to be an ordinary road trip. My buddies and I were heading back from a weekend in the mountains, taking the scenic route to enjoy the last bits of freedom before the grind of work life resumed. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the horizon, when we stumbled upon it, a carnival in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't on any map. There were no signs advertising it, and we hadn't seen another car or person for miles. But there it was, lights flashing, music blaring, and rides spinning as if it were the height of summer. It seemed odd, but we were curious. And what's the harm in checking it out, right? We parked the car and walked towards the entrance, where a rusty old sign read, "The Forgotten Carnival." I remember thinking the name was strange, but I didn't dwell on it. The place had an old-timey feel to it, like it had been plucked out of the 1920s and dropped into our time. But everything was in perfect working order, even though it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. As we entered, we noticed something even stranger. There were no people. The rides were moving, the games were set up, but there wasn't a single soul in sight. No kids laughing, no parents chasing after them, nothing. Just us, the lights, and that eerie music.
Maybe it hasn't opened yet.
My friend Tom suggested, but it didn't make sense. Why would the rides be running if the carnival wasn't open? We decided to explore, splitting up to see what we could find. I headed towards the Ferris wheel, drawn by its bright lights. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The seats were occupied by mannequins. Not just any mannequins, though. These were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces painted with expressions of terror. It was as if they had been frozen in their last moments of fear. I quickly backed away, feeling uneasy, and bumped into Lisa, one of the girls in our group. She had gone to check out the game stalls, but had returned pale and shaken.
You need to see this.
She said, grabbing my arm and pulling me towards the games. What I saw was disturbing, to say the least. The prizes weren't the usual stuffed animals or plastic toys. Instead, they were old, worn-out dolls with cracked porcelain faces, their eyes following us as we moved. And the worst part? The game attendants were also mannequins, but these looked even more lifelike. Too lifelike. Something's wrong here, I muttered, and Lisa nodded in agreement. We decided to find the others and get out of there, but as we made our way back to the entrance, the carnival seemed to stretch on endlessly. The pathways twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, leading us deeper into the heart of the carnival instead of back to where we started. The music grew louder, more discordant, and the lights began to flicker, casting long, twisted shadows. The once bright and cheerful atmosphere now felt oppressive, suffocating. Panic set in as we realized we were lost in this nightmare, with no way out. We finally found Tom and the others near the funhouse, but they weren't alone. Standing with them were more mannequins, these ones dressed as carnival barkers and clowns, their painted smiles twisted into grotesque grins. And as we approached, the mannequins began to move. It was subtle at first, a slight turn of the head, a blink of an eye. But then they started to walk towards us, their stiff limbs jerking unnaturally. We ran, but no matter how fast we moved, the mannequins seemed to be right behind us, their hollow eyes staring into our souls. We made it to the entrance only to find it blocked by more mannequins. They were closing in on us, their hands outstretched as if to grab us. Desperation took over, and we fought our way through, pushing past the lifeless figures, ignoring the way their cold, plastic hands brushed against our skin. We finally burst out into the night, gasping for air, our hearts pounding. The carnival was gone. Behind us, there was nothing but an empty field. The lights and music vanished as if they had never existed. We didn't say a word as we got back into the car and drove away as fast as we could. But the memory of that night haunts me still. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the faint sound of carnival music, and I wonder, was it all just a dream? Or did we really stumble upon something that should have remained forgotten? Funerals are never pleasant, but my grandfather's funeral was particularly unsettling. It wasn't because of the somber atmosphere, the grieving relatives, or even the biting chill of the overcast day. No, it was something much more sinister that left a scar on my soul. A scar I carry to this very day. The cemetery was old, the kind of place where time had long ago given up, and nature began reclaiming what was once taken. Weeds choked the gravestones, their engravings eroded by decades of rain and wind. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the wind whispered through the towering oaks like voices that weren't meant to be heard. My family was gathered near a modest plot where we were burying my grandfather. He was a hard man, stoic, quiet, and intimidating even in his old age. He rarely spoke of his past, and when he did, it was never about anything deeper than his days in the army. As far as I knew, he never made any close friends, and his relationship with my family was distant at best. The service was brief, the priest's words swallowed by the overcast sky, as if even God had better things to do that day. I stood at the edge of the small crowd, distant not just physically but emotionally. I had never been particularly close to my grandfather, so I wasn't feeling the same overwhelming grief as my parents and cousins. But there was something else, a tension in the air, something more than just the collective sorrow. As the coffin was lowered into the grave, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I assumed it was just another mourner standing a little further back. But when I turned my head to get a better look, I froze. Standing a few rows away, partially obscured by a tall monument, was a man I didn't recognize. He was dressed in an old-fashioned black coat, the kind you'd expect to see in a 19th century photograph. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel his eyes on me. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized he wasn't part of the funeral. There was something wrong about him, something unnatural. But when I blinked, he was gone. I shook it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. Funerals are emotional events, and it's easy to imagine things that aren't really there. Still, the memory of that shadowy figure lingered in my mind as we left the cemetery. But that was only the beginning. Later that night, after the funeral, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting back to the cemetery, to the man I had seen, or thought I had seen. I got up and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. My bedroom overlooked the woods that bordered our small town, and normally, the sight of the trees swaying gently in the breeze would calm me. But tonight, something felt wrong. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the treetops. I squinted, trying to make out the shapes in the darkness. And that's when I saw him. The man from the cemetery. He was standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden by the shadows of the trees. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching my house. My heart began to race. I wanted to believe it was just some trick of the light, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I blinked, and he was gone. I slammed the window shut, drawing the curtains tightly. I told myself it was just stress, a product of the emotional day I'd had. But as I climbed back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The following day, I couldn't focus on anything. I felt like I was in a fog, my mind constantly drifting back to the cemetery, to the strange man. I decided to visit my grandfather's grave one more time, thinking maybe it would give me some closure. Maybe I'd imagine the whole thing. I arrived at the cemetery in the late afternoon. The sun was already setting, casting long shadows over the graves. I walked slowly, weaving through the rows of headstones until I reached my grandfather's grave. The plot was still fresh, the dirt uneven, where the coffin had been lowered just the day before. I stood there for a moment, staring at the mound of earth, unsure of what I was expecting to feel. And then I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, carried on the wind.
You shouldn't be here.
I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. The cemetery was empty, at least it appeared to be, but I could feel something watching me, lurking just beyond the reach of my sight. The wind picked up, swirling leaves around my feet, and for a moment I thought I saw the man again, standing behind a tall obelisk a few rows away. But when I blinked, he was gone. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing. I didn't care if I was imagining things or not. I needed to get out of there. I turned and hurried back to my car, my footsteps echoing off the gravestones as I went. But just as I reached the entrance to the cemetery, I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing in the middle of the path blocking my way was the man in the black coat. He was closer now, and I could see his face, or rather, the absence of one. His face was a pale, featureless void, and yet I could feel his eyes boring into me.
Leave.
The voice whispered again, though his mouth didn't move. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. The man raised a hand, pointing towards the graveyard, and I knew instinctively what he wanted.
Leave, or you'll join them.
I didn't wait to find out what that meant. Somehow I found the strength to run, my legs carrying me as fast as they could. I reached my car, fumbling with the keys before finally managing to start the engine. I didn't look back as I sped away, but I could feel his presence behind me, watching me, following me. That night, I locked every door and window in the house, but sleep still wouldn't come. The image of that faceless man haunted my thoughts. What did he want from me? Why was he watching me? Days passed, but the fear never left. Every time I stepped outside, I felt his eyes on me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. And then one night, I awoke to a sound outside my window. A soft scratching sound, like fingernails on glass. I forced myself to look, and there he was. The man in the black coat, standing right outside my window, his face pressed against the glass, his hands slowly tracing patterns on the pane.
You'll join them.
His voice whispered, echoing in my mind. I screamed and ran from the room, but by the time my parents came to check, he was gone. That was the last time I saw him, but the memory lingers. The faceless man from the cemetery, he's still out there waiting. And someday,
You'll join them.
I fear he'll come for me again. I've always had an odd fascination with abandoned places. Maybe it was the thrill of danger or the chance to explore forgotten history. But whenever I saw a decaying house with boarded up windows and crumbling walls, I couldn't resist the temptation to peek inside. I never thought anything bad could actually happen until the day I stepped foot inside the house on Ridgeview Lane. It was the summer of 2022, and I was on a road trip with my friend Tom. We'd been driving aimlessly through rural Pennsylvania, looking for something to break up the monotony of endless farmland. That's when we saw it, just off the main road, a massive Victorian house hidden behind overgrown trees and brush.
Looks like it's been abandoned for decades.
Tom said as we pulled up to the rusted gate.
You want to check it out?
I didn't hesitate. We parked the car and made our way toward the house. The front yard was a jungle of weeds and vines, and the house itself was in even worse shape. Paint peeled from the siding, and several windows were broken, revealing nothing but darkness inside.
Place gives me the creeps,
Tom muttered, though I could hear the curiosity in his voice. He wasn't turning back, and neither was I. We pushed through the front door, which hung crookedly on its hinges, and stepped into the entry hall. The air inside was stale and heavy, filled with the smell of mildew and rot. Dust clung to every surface, and the silence was oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. "It's bigger than I expected," I said, my voice echoing faintly through the hall. As we wandered deeper, it became clear this place had been abandoned for a long time. Old, rotting furniture sat untouched, and there were remnants of the past, an old newspaper from the 1960s, a cracked mirror, family portraits so faded you could barely make out the faces. Everything was frozen in time. We eventually made our way to the second floor, where the atmosphere felt different, heavier. I can't explain it, but there was a strange tension in the air, like we weren't alone. I tried to brush it off as nerves, but then I heard it, a soft creak, like footsteps on the floorboards above us. "Did you hear that?" I asked, glancing at Tom.
Probably just the house settling,
He replied, but I could tell he was just as spooked as I was. We moved cautiously down the hallway, pausing outside each door. Most of the rooms were empty, their doors left open as if inviting us in. But there was one door at the end of the hall that was closed, and locked.
What do you think's in there?
Tom whispered, staring at the door. I didn't know, but something about it unnerved me. My instincts screamed to turn back, but curiosity won out. We searched the nearby rooms until we found a rusty key lying on the floor of what must have been a bedroom. It looked old, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, and the door creaked open. Inside, the room was dark. So dark we couldn't see more than a few feet in front of us. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam illuminated a small, cluttered space. Dust-covered furniture was scattered around, but what caught my eye was the large wooden chest in the corner. It looked ancient, its surface carved with strange symbols I didn't recognize. The air in the room felt colder, and I could swear I heard faint whispering, like someone speaking just out of earshot.
Let's open it.
Tom said, stepping forward. I hesitated, but Tom was already kneeling beside the chest, prying open the heavy lid. The hinges squealed, and inside we found bones. Human bones, piled haphazardly in the chest. Some were still attached to scraps of decayed clothing, and a skull stared up at us with empty eye sockets. I stumbled back, my heart racing. We need to leave, now. But before we could move, the door slammed shut behind us. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with a chilling sense of dread. I turned to the door, tugging at the handle, but it wouldn't budge.
We're trapped,
Tom said, his voice trembling. What the hell is happening? Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. The whispering turned into a low, guttural moan, and then, from the darkest corner of the room, something moved. It was a figure, tall and gaunt, its face hidden beneath a hood of shadows. The air around it crackled with an unnatural energy. It spoke, though I couldn't understand the words. But the intent was clear. It was angry, furious. This house had been its domain for decades, and we had trespassed where we didn't belong. I backed away, grabbing Tom's arm. We have to get out of here. The figure moved closer, its form flickering like a dying flame. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, and panic surged through me. In a last-ditch effort, I threw my weight against the door, and it burst open with a loud crack. We didn't look back as we sprinted down the stairs and out of the house, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The moment we crossed the threshold, the oppressive weight lifted, and the whispering stopped. We jumped into the car and sped away, not daring to speak until the house was far behind us.
That was real, right?
Tom finally asked, his voice shaky. I nodded, still trying to calm my racing heart. Yeah, it was real. We never went back to Ridgeview Lane, and I never set foot in another abandoned house again. Whatever we disturbed in that place, it's still there, waiting for the next person foolish enough to enter. Last Halloween, I got a call from a realtor who needed help with an unusual property. It was Rosenwood Manor, a decrepit old house that had a dark reputation in our town. Anyone who had grown up around here had heard the stories about the manor, how people who entered often left in pieces, both mentally and physically. But I'd never put much stock in ghost stories. And as a professional real estate consultant, I had seen my share of creepy old buildings. It was just another job, or so I thought. The moment I agreed to meet the client, I felt a subtle creeping unease, but I brushed it aside. The house had been on the market for years, and the owners were desperate to sell. Still, something felt off as I prepared to visit Rosenwood Manor. The realtor had warned me that the house was in a remote area, deep in the woods, far from any neighbors or main roads, but that didn't bother me. Isolation was part of its appeal to some buyers, but there was a nervousness in his voice, something he didn't say outright, but I could feel in his hesitation before hanging up. The drive out there took me down winding, narrow roads that became progressively darker as the trees closed in. The late afternoon sky was overcast, casting the woods in a gloomy, muted light. By the time I arrived, it was early evening, and the shadows were long, stretching across the decaying grounds of the mansion like skeletal fingers. The first thing I noticed was the sheer size of the place. Rosenwood Manor loomed over the landscape, its once grand facade now weathered and crumbling. Ivy crawled up the stone walls, and several windows were either broken or boarded up. The air felt heavy, as though the house itself was aware of my presence and didn't want me there. I parked my car and walked to the entrance, the gravel crunching beneath my feet unnervingly loud in the silence. The front door was enormous, made of dark wood with heavy brass handles, and it creaked open as soon as I touched it. A cold draft swept out, carrying with it the scent of mold and rot. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding absurdly small in the vast, empty space of the front hall. No answer. The interior of the manor was even more oppressive than the exterior. High ceilings and grand, sweeping staircases couldn't disguise the decay that had set in over decades. The wallpaper was peeling, the floors creaked ominously with every step, and cobwebs draped like curtains in every corner. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the sense of unease that had been growing since I arrived. I was here for a professional evaluation, so I did what I came to do. I began a thorough walkthrough of the house. As I made my way through the rooms, each one seemed to carry its own heavy atmosphere, as though the house was trying to communicate something dark and sinister. I passed through what looked like an old dining room, where a massive, dust-covered table sat beneath a tarnished chandelier. Plates were still on the table, as though someone had left in the middle of dinner and never returned. In the next room, I found something even stranger. A collection of old photographs on the walls depicting what seemed to be the former inhabitants of Rosenwood Manor. One particular portrait caught my attention. A family of 5, all dressed in late 19th century clothing. The parents stood stiffly, their faces somber, but the children, there was something wrong with their eyes. Their gazes seemed to follow me, no matter where I stood. It was as if they were watching me, waiting for something. My heart was beginning to race, but I tried to laugh it off. "It's just a trick of the light," I muttered under my breath. But as I turned to leave, I could have sworn I saw one of the children in the portrait smile, a slow, malicious grin. I quickened my pace, moving deeper into the house, determined to finish my walkthrough as quickly as possible. Every room felt colder than the last, the temperature seeming to drop unnaturally the farther I went. At one point, I found myself in a narrow hallway lined with closed doors. The air was still, and the only sound was my breathing, loud and shallow. Then, from behind one of the doors, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. I froze. My flashlight beam wavered as I strained to listen. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, as though someone or something was on the other side of the door, waiting for me to come closer. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe it was an animal trapped inside, or just the wind rattling a loose window. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone in this house. Against my better judgment, I approached the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob for what felt like an eternity. Slowly, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. Nothing. The room was empty, but the tapping continued. It was coming from the wall. I stepped closer, and suddenly the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I backed out of the room and shut the door behind me, trying to control the panic rising in my chest. It was then that I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the halls. They weren't mine, and there was no one else supposed to be here. My heart pounded in my ears as I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction. But the long hallway was empty. Still, the footsteps grew louder, coming closer. I bolted, racing down the corridor, my footsteps now thundering in a blind panic. I could feel something behind me, chasing me, closing in. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled into the front hall, desperate to get out. But when I reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. I pulled at it with all my strength, but it was as if the door had been welded shut. The footsteps stopped. I turned around slowly, and there, at the top of the grand staircase, stood a figure. A tall, shadowy silhouette, completely still. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, watching me. I fumbled for my phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. The figure began to descend the stairs, moving in slow, deliberate steps. I backed away, my hands shaking, and darted down a side corridor, desperately searching for another way out. I found myself in what looked like a library, the walls lined with bookshelves that stretched up to the ceiling. There, in the center of the room, stood an old, ornate mirror. As I stepped closer, the surface of the mirror rippled, as if the glass was made of water. And then, in the reflection, I saw something move behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the mirror, I saw myself, but not quite. My reflection wore a twisted, malevolent smile. It raised its hand, beckoning me closer. I bolted out of the library, my pulse racing. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to escape. I ran through room after room, the house seeming to shift and change around me, twisting into a maze of endless corridors and dead ends. Finally, I found a back door that led outside. I burst through it, stumbling into the cold night air. The silence was deafening, and the forest around the manor seemed to swallow me whole as I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away, leaving Rosenwood Manor and its horrors far behind. I never went back, and the house remains unsold to this day. Sometimes I wonder if the next person who steps inside will make it out, or if the house will claim them too. Whatever lurks within Rosenwood Manor is waiting, watching, ready to consume the next soul foolish enough to enter. I've always loved the thrill of yard sales. There's something special about finding old, forgotten items with stories waiting to be uncovered. It felt like stepping into someone else's past and bringing home a piece of it. Last summer, on a humid Saturday morning, I stumbled across what seemed like an innocent and charming porcelain doll at a neighborhood sale. It was delicate, with a pale face, soft, glassy blue eyes, and golden curls. Her dress was old-fashioned, a lacy white frock with a blue ribbon tied around her waist. The best part? It was only $5. I remember the woman selling it, a frail old lady with thinning gray hair. Her eyes darted nervously to the doll as she handed it to me.
Are you sure you want this?
She asked, her voice trembling slightly. At the time, I thought it was just a silly question. Why wouldn't I want it? The doll was beautiful, and I knew my niece would love it. I laughed and assured her it was exactly what I was looking for. My niece collects dolls, I said, unaware of the weight of her next words.
Just be careful.
She whispered. The look in her eyes sent a small chill down my spine. But I brushed it off. I thought it was just an eccentric old lady trying to add some mystery to a harmless object. Once I brought the doll home, I set it on a shelf in my bedroom until I could give it to my niece. It looked so perfect sitting there, like a quiet observer of the room. For a couple of days, everything was fine. Then, things started to change. At first, it was just a small noise at night. A soft rustling sound, like fabric brushing against the floor. I dismissed it as nothing. Just the house settling, or the curtains moving with the breeze. But the more I heard it, the harder it became to ignore. One night, while lying in bed, I heard it again. Only this time, it was followed by the faintest sound of footsteps. I sat up, heart racing, and flicked on the light. The room was empty. The doll was still on the shelf, staring straight ahead as if nothing had happened. But the next morning when I woke up, the doll wasn't where I had left it. It had moved. Not just shifted slightly, but moved entirely. Now sitting upright on the floor, facing the bed, I stared at it, frozen with disbelief. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe I had knocked it over, or someone else had moved it without me realizing. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, I placed the doll back on the shelf, making sure it was secure. I even took a picture of it to remind myself that I wasn't imagining things. But once again, I woke up in the middle of the night to an eerie sound, like the soft patter of tiny feet across the hardwood floor. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. Slowly, I turned my head towards the sound, and there it was, the doll, now sitting in the doorway of my bedroom, its lifeless eyes locked onto mine. I leaped out of bed, grabbed the doll, and locked it in the closet. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for something to happen. Nothing. The house was silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I barely slept that night, constantly waking to check the closet door. For the next few days, I kept the doll locked away. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. At night, I'd hear scratching sounds coming from the closet, like tiny nails scraping against the wood, desperate to get out. I could hardly sleep, my nerves fraying more with each passing hour. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe I was just overreacting. Maybe stress from work was making me paranoid. One evening, after yet another sleepless night, I finally decided to call the woman who had sold me the doll. Her phone number was on the sales receipt, and I needed answers. When she picked up, there was an immediate tension in her voice.
I didn't want to tell you,
she said softly.
But that doll, it's cursed. It used to belong to my grandmother. She loved that doll more than anything. But after she passed, strange things started happening in our house. I tried to get rid of it so many times, but it always came back. Please, you have to believe me. That doll doesn't like to be ignored.
Her words sent a shiver down my spine. It couldn't be true, could it? I tried to calm myself, but her warning echoed in my head. It didn't like to be ignored. I knew I had to get rid of the doll once and for all. So I drove out to the river that night, throwing the cursed thing into the water. I stood on the bank, watching as it sank beneath the surface, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me. I thought it was over. For 2 nights, I slept soundly, with no signs of the doll returning. But then, on the 3rd night, I woke up to a familiar sound. Soft footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up in bed, and there it was. Sitting at the foot of my bed, water dripping from its soaked dress. I screamed, grabbing the doll and throwing it across the room. It landed with a sickening thud, but didn't move. In the dim light, I could see its glassy eyes, staring at me with that cold, lifeless gaze. The next day, I tried to throw it away again, this time at the city dump, far from my home. But every time I tried to leave, I'd find it back in my room, sitting patiently, waiting for me. Things escalated after that. The doll began to appear in places I hadn't left it, in my car, at my workplace, even at my niece's house. My mind was unraveling, and I could feel the weight of its curse pressing down on me. It was everywhere, haunting me day and night. My health began to deteriorate as I grew more obsessed with the doll, unable to escape its presence. I became paranoid, constantly checking my surroundings, knowing it was always watching. I reached out to a priest, desperate for help. He agreed to bless my home, hoping it would rid me of the evil presence. As he performed the ritual, the air grew thick and cold. The doll sat motionless on the floor, but I swear I saw its eyes narrow as the priest chanted the final prayer. After the blessing, things were quiet again. I didn't see the doll for weeks, and I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I had finally broken the curse. But one night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, the faintest whisper. I sat up, my heart pounding, and there it was, sitting on the shelf where it all began. Its glassy eyes locked onto mine. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. My girlfriend, Emily, and I had been planning it for weeks. Just a scenic drive through the heartland, stopping at small towns along the way. We wanted to get away from the city, find some peace and quiet, and experience the rural charm of the Midwest. We were 2 days into our trip when things started to go wrong. It was getting late, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields as we drove along an empty 2-lane highway. Cornfields stretched on either side, an endless sea of green and gold. There were no houses, no other cars, just miles and miles of nothing.
We should find a place to stop for the night,
Emily said, glancing at the map on her phone. There's a small town about 20 miles ahead. Perfect, I replied, relieved. The drive had been beautiful, but the isolation was starting to get to me. It felt like we were the only 2 people left in the world. As the last light of day faded, a thick fog rolled in. It was sudden, swallowing up the road and the fields around us. I slowed the car to a crawl, squinting to see the yellow lines ahead.
Where did this fog come from?
Emily asked, her voice tinged with nervousness. I don't know, I said, gripping the steering wheel tighter. But I don't like it. We continued driving slowly, the fog growing thicker with every mile. The cornfields on either side became ghostly shapes in the mist, their towering stalks barely visible. The air felt heavy, oppressive. Then the car sputtered. Come on, I muttered, pressing the gas. The engine stuttered again, then died completely. We coasted to a stop on the side of the road. You've got to be kidding me, I groaned, banging the steering wheel in frustration.
Now?
Emily checked her phone, but there was no signal. Great, we're stuck in the middle of nowhere with no reception. I popped the hood and stepped out of the car, the cool night air immediately sending a chill down my spine. The fog was even thicker outside, clinging to everything like a living thing. I fiddled with the engine for a few minutes, but I wasn't much of a mechanic. Nothing I did seemed to help. I'll try to flag down someone, I said, glancing down the empty road, though I hadn't seen a car in over an hour. Emily stayed in the car while I stood by the roadside, waving my flashlight in the mist, hoping for a passing vehicle. But there was nothing, just the silence of the night and the distant rustle of corn swaying in the breeze. At least, that's what I thought it was at first. But as I stood there, the rustling grew louder, more deliberate. I turned toward the field, shining my flashlight into the rows of corn. The light barely penetrated the fog, but I could see the tops of the stalks moving, as if something or someone was moving through them. Emily, I called, my voice tight with fear. I think there's something out there. She rolled down the window, her face pale.
What do you mean?
Before I could answer, the rustling stopped. The night fell into a heavy, unnatural silence, the kind that presses in on your ears and makes your heart race. Then I saw it, a figure, just at the edge of the cornfield, barely visible in the fog, tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs. It stood completely still, watching me. I froze, my mouth going dry. Emily, get out of the car.
Why?
She asked, confused. Just get out, I said, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. It hadn't moved, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and hostile. Emily stepped out of the car, and when she looked toward the cornfield, she gasped.
What is that?
I don't know, I whispered, but we need to go. Now. We backed away from the car, keeping our eyes on the figure. As we moved, it took a step forward, its long limbs moving with an unnatural grace. Then another step, and another. Suddenly there was more movement in the corn. Dozens of figures, just like the first one, emerged from the field, all moving toward us in eerie, synchronized steps. Run! I shouted, grabbing Emily's hand. We bolted down the road, the fog swirling around us. The sound of footsteps, heavy rhythmic, echoed behind us, growing louder as the figures gained speed. My heart pounded in my chest, panic clawing at my mind. I glanced back and my stomach dropped. They were faster than us, their long limbs covering the ground effortlessly. I didn't know where we were running. There was no town, no lights, just the endless fog and the narrow strip of road cutting through the fields. But we had no choice. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs screamed in protest. Then, up ahead, a faint light pierced the fog. A house. There, I gasped. Run for it. We sprinted toward the light, the footsteps behind us growing louder, closer. I could almost feel the figure's cold presence right behind me. We reached the house, a small, run-down farmhouse at the edge of the field. I slammed into the front door, pounding on it with both fists. Help! Let us in! I shouted. There was no answer. The footsteps stopped. I turned and saw them, just a few yards away now, the figure standing motionless in the fog, watching us with empty eyes. Emily screamed. The door creaked open, and an old man stood there, his face lined with age and fear.
Get inside! Now!
We didn't need to be told twice. We stumbled into the house, and the man slammed the door shut behind us, bolting it tight. I pressed my back against the door, breathing hard. What are those things? Emily stammered, shaking uncontrollably. The old man's face was grim.
They're the stalkers. They come from the corn, looking for lost souls to take back with them.
I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. What do they want? He shook his head.
No one knows for sure, but once they've marked you, they won't stop until they have you.
A chill ran down my spine. Marked? How do we stop them? The man didn't answer. He just looked out the window, his eyes filled with a sadness I couldn't comprehend. We stayed in that farmhouse for the rest of the night, huddled together in fear. Outside, the stalkers stood motionless, watching the house, waiting. They didn't try to break in. They didn't make a sound. They just stood there, silently. By morning, the fog had lifted and the figures were gone. The old man told us to leave, to never come back. We didn't argue. We drove away from that place as fast as we could, but the feeling of being watched never left. Even now, I can still feel their eyes on me. They're out there somewhere, in the fields, and I know one day they'll come for me. Tonight, we've seen how the ordinary can turn into the terrifying. Cornfields, those quiet and unassuming rows of crops, hide more than just secrets. They hide nightmares waiting to emerge. Whether it's a simple trip into a maze, a peaceful life on a farm, or an innocent road trip through rural America, the unknown can find you when you least expect it. So the next time you pass by a field of corn, think twice about what might be hiding among the stalks. And remember, if you ever hear footsteps behind you or see figures watching from the field, don't stop. Keep moving before it's too late. This is Mr. Scary Guy, reminding you to sleep well, if you dare. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe by clicking the icon above. We've also got a playlist full of scary stories on your left side, and a suggested video you'll love on the right. Choose one and keep the scares going.